In 1692, in a small Puritan village, a 4-year-old girl was arrested for witchcraft. She was taken from her mother, chained in a dungeon, and interrogated by grown men. Her name was Dorothy Good, and her story isn't one you'll find in most textbooks. We've all heard the familiar tale of the Salem witch trials, a story of mass hysteria, teenage girls having fits, and a community spiraling into madness. It's a neat, simple explanation. But the truth is far darker and more calculated. The real story of Salem isn't about a sudden panic. It's a story of hidden agendas, bitter family feuds, and personal vendettas that used religious fervor as a cover to settle old scores. It's a story of how the most vulnerable were targeted, how justice was twisted, and how a quiet cover-up tried to bury the sins of the powerful. Beyond the myth of mass hysteria lies a web of shocking secrets, forgotten victims, coerced confessions, and stunning courtroom theatrics that sealed the fates of innocent people. These weren't random accusations. They were targeted attacks. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten stories that expose the calculated cruelty behind America's most infamous witch hunt. We'll reveal who was really pulling the strings, the personal grudges that fueled the flames, and the shocking aftermath that followed the hangings. Chapter 1: The Spark in the Powder Keg. To understand the firestorm that engulfed Salem, you have to understand the world where it ignited. Colonial Massachusetts in the late 17th century was a place of deep, profound anxiety. Life was perched on a knife's edge. This was a devout Puritan society that saw the world as a literal battlefield between God and Satan. They believed the devil wasn't some distant idea, but an active, present threat in their daily lives. Every misfortune, a failed crop, a sick child, a sudden death could be seen as a sign of God's displeasure, or, even worse, the devil's work. This simmering religious paranoia was happening amidst intense social and political stress. Recent conflicts, known as King William's War, had torn through New England, leaving a deep psychological scar on the colonists. Entire towns were destroyed, families were slaughtered, and a wave of traumatized refugees flooded into Essex County, straining resources and bringing with them horrifying stories of violence. Some of the young women who would soon become the most vocal accusers in Salem, like Mercy Lewis, were refugees from these attacks. Their minds already primed for terror and their lives defined by loss. Into this tense landscape came another source of conflict. Salem itself was a community divided. It was split into two distinct parts: Salem Town, a prosperous port with a growing merchant class, and the more isolated farming community of Salem Village, where life was harder and traditions were held more tightly. The farmers of Salem Village resented the growing wealth and influence of Salem Town, and this economic rivalry festered into bitter factions that poisoned the community. Two families came to represent this division: the Putnams and the Porters. The Putnams were a powerful land-owning family in the village, staunchly conservative and leading the charge to create their own independent church. The Porters, with business interests tied to the town, opposed this separation and represented a more moderate worldview. This feud wasn't just a disagreement. It was a deep-seated power struggle that had been brewing for years, creating fault lines of resentment that ran through the entire village. The final ingredient in this volatile mix was Reverend Samuel Parris. Appointed as Salem Village's first minister in 1689, largely thanks to the Putnams, Parris was a rigid and greedy man who quickly became a source of controversy. His sermons were filled with fire and brimstone, hammering on the presence of evil. He demanded a higher salary and special privileges, which only angered those who already opposed his appointment, especially the Porter faction. It was in the heart of this fractured, fearful community in the very home of Reverend Parris that the spark was finally lit in the winter of 1692. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to exhibit terrifying behaviors. They screamed, threw things, contorted their bodies into unnatural positions, and complained of being pinched by invisible forces. When a local doctor found no physical cause, he delivered a diagnosis that would change history. The girls were under the influence of an evil hand. They were bewitched. Pressured to name their tormentors, the girls pointed to 3 people. It was no accident who they chose. The first accused were not respected members of the church. They were 3 of the most marginalized women in the village: Tituba, Reverend Parris's own enslaved woman; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly widow tangled in social scandal and property disputes. They were the perfect scapegoats, women on the fringes of society, easy targets for a community desperate for answers. The stage was set, the victims were chosen, and the powder keg of Salem was about to explode. Chapter 2. The First Accused. A perfect storm of outcasts. The initial accusations were a masterclass in targeting the defenseless. Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne represented everything Puritan society feared: foreignness, poverty, and social defiance. They were women without power or allies, and their stories reveal the calculated nature of the trials from the very beginning. Let's start with Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household. Her exact origins are still debated by historians. She was brought from Barbados and was likely of indigenous, African, or mixed heritage, making her an outsider in every sense. After the girls began their fits, a neighbor suggested a bit of countermagic: baking a witch cake. This cake, made from rye and the urine of the afflicted girls, was fed to a dog, with the belief it would reveal the witch. Tituba was involved in making this cake. When Reverend Parris found out, he was furious, and this act likely sealed her fate. Following her arrest, Tituba at first denied being a witch. But she was in an impossible position. As an enslaved woman, she was subjected to intense pressure from her owner, Samuel Parris, who, it is widely believed, may have beaten her to force a confession. Under this pressure, Tituba did something that changed everything. She confessed, and she didn't just confess. She gave the magistrates a spectacular, terrifying story. She spoke of signing the devil's book. She described a tall man from Boston with white hair who demanded she serve him. She told them about riding on sticks through the night and named her supposed accomplices, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. She populated the dark woods of Salem with a whole cast of demonic servants: a black dog, a red cat, a yellow bird. Her confession was a bombshell. For a community that believed in a literal Satan, Tituba's story wasn't seen as the desperate fantasy of a terrified, abused woman. It was seen as concrete proof. It confirmed their deepest fears. This wasn't just one witch, but a full-blown conspiracy of evil in their village. Tituba's confession did save her from the gallows. The court generally spared those who confessed and named others. But she was left to rot in a Boston jail for over a year because Reverend Parris refused to pay her prison fees. Eventually, someone paid for her release, and she was sold to a new master. After that, Tituba vanishes completely from the historical record. The second accused was Sarah Good, the opposite of a respected Puritan woman. She was homeless, impoverished, and forced to wander the village, begging for food. Pregnant at the time of her arrest, she had a reputation for being ill-tempered and muttering under her breath when people turned her away, mutterings that villagers easily reinterpreted as curses. Her poverty made her an incredibly easy target. In court, unlike Tituba, Sarah Good was defiant. She fiercely maintained her innocence but fell into the court's trap by accusing Sarah Osborne, likely a desperate attempt to deflect blame. The afflicted girls in the courtroom put on a terrifying show, writhing in agony whenever Good so much as looked at them. The most heartbreaking detail of her story is that her 4-year-old daughter, Dorothy, was also arrested and coerced into testifying against her. Sarah Good was found guilty. She gave birth in jail, but her newborn infant died in the squalid conditions. On July 19, 1692, as she stood on Gallows Hill, Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess. Her final words to him were a chilling prophecy: "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." The third woman, Sarah Osborne, breaks the stereotype of the poor, haggard witch. She was a wealthy widow, but her wealth is exactly what made her a target. She had caused a major scandal in Salem Village. First, she married her Irish indentured servant, an act that defied Puritan social norms. Second, and more importantly, she was in a legal battle over her late husband's estate. She had tried to seize control of her son's inheritance, a move that put her in direct conflict with the powerful Putnam family. Accused alongside Tituba and Good, Osborne was already chronically ill at the time of her arrest. Like Sarah Good, she maintained her innocence. But she would never face a trial. The harsh conditions of the 17th century jail were too much for her fragile health. On May 10, 1692, Sarah Osborne died in chains in a Boston prison, still protesting her innocence. These first 3 accusations reveal the blueprint for the entire witch hunt. They weren't random. They were meticulously selected. An enslaved woman with foreign beliefs, a destitute beggar, and a controversial widow who challenged social norms and a powerful family's financial interests. They were the unwanted, the inconvenient, and the vulnerable. Chapter 3: The Unraveling of a Community. The Accusations Spread. With Tituba's confession seemingly confirming a satanic plot, the floodgates of paranoia were thrown wide open. The hunt was no longer about just 3 women. It was about rooting out a vast conspiracy. And as the accusations began to fly, they ensnared people who were far from marginalized, revealing that this was becoming about power, control, and settling old scores. The first person executed in the trials was Bridget Bishop, hanged on June 10, 1692. Bishop was a woman who seemed to defy the rigid expectations of Puritan womanhood. She had been married 3 times, was known for her flamboyant style of dress, including a red bodice considered scandalous, and she owned a tavern, a place associated with drinking and disorderly behavior. She was outspoken and had been accused of witchcraft years earlier, though she was acquitted. In the conformist world of Salem, Bridget Bishop stood out, and that made her dangerous. Her trial was a spectacle of the absurd, built almost entirely on spectral evidence. This was the claim by accusers that the ghost or specter of the accused had appeared to them and caused them harm. In the courtroom, the afflicted girls would fall into violent fits, screaming that Bridget Bishop's specter was tormenting them. In a piece of damning courtroom theater, their fits would stop the moment Bishop was forced to touch them, supposedly proving she was the source. Neighbors came forward with stories of bewitched pigs and spoiled butter. Workmen claimed to find poppets, dolls made of rags with pins stuck in them, hidden in her cellar walls. Despite her repeated denials, the weight of the spectral testimony and her reputation was too much. Her execution sent a clear and terrifying message. Anyone who deviated from the norm was at risk. If Bridget Bishop's execution showed that nonconformity could be a death sentence, the accusation of Martha Corey proved that not even piety could protect you. This was a true turning point. Martha Corey was a 72-year-old, devout, and respected member of the church. Crucially, she was also an outspoken critic of the trials. From the beginning, she had expressed deep skepticism, laughing at the idea of witchcraft and dismissing the girls' fits as nonsense. In a community gripped by fear, this kind of rational dissent was seen as deeply suspicious. By questioning the proceedings, Martha Corey made herself a threat. Her accusation shocked the community. If a woman as pious as Martha Corey could be a witch, then anyone could. It showed that the circle of accusation was widening to include not just outcasts, but anyone who dared to challenge the official story. During her examination, she maintained her innocence with remarkable strength, famously declaring, "I am a gospel woman." But her past didn't help her. Years earlier, she'd had an illegitimate child, a stain on her reputation that was dredged up as evidence of a flawed character. She was convicted and hanged on September 22, 1692. The story of Martha's husband, Giles Corey, is perhaps the most brutal episode in the entire saga. Giles was an 81-year-old farmer with a reputation for being stubborn. He had a troubled past, having once been charged with beating a farmhand to death. Initially, Giles actually believed the accusations and even testified against his own wife. But as the hysteria grew and he himself was accused, he realized the terrifying injustice of it all. When his case came to trial, Giles Corey made a fateful decision. He refused to enter a plea. He wouldn't say guilty or not guilty. Under the law at the time, a person who refused to plead could not be tried. His motive was likely a calculated legal move. By avoiding a conviction, he hoped to prevent his farm from being seized by the state, ensuring it would pass to his sons-in-law. The penalty for refusing to plead was a horrific form of torture known as pressing to death. It was a punishment so barbaric it had never before been used in Massachusetts. On September 19, 1692, Giles Corey was taken to a field, stripped, and had a board placed on his chest. For 2 days, heavy stones were piled onto the board, one by one, slowly crushing the life out of him. The sheriff repeatedly demanded he enter a plea. According to legend, Giles Corey's only response was to gasp out 2 defiant words: "More weight." He died under the stones, an unyielding martyr whose brutal death sent shockwaves through the community and likely helped turn public opinion against the trials. Just 3 days later, his wife Martha was hanged. Chapter 4: The Children of Salem, Victims and Perpetrators. While the story of Salem is often framed around adults, some of its most harrowing secrets lie with the children. They were not just the accusers. They were also the accused, caught in a web of adult fears and manipulations. The stories of Dorothy Good, the youngest accused witch, and Ann Putnam Jr., the most prolific young accuser, shatter the simple narrative of hysterical teenagers. Perhaps no story illustrates the sheer cruelty of the trials more than that of Dorothy Good. She was 4 years old. After her mother, Sarah Good, was arrested, Dorothy herself was accused. The warrant for her arrest charged her with acts of witchcraft. The accusers claimed that Dorothy's specter bit them, and the magistrates interrogated the terrified toddler. She confessed to owning a snake that her mother had given her, which she said would suck blood from her finger, a detail the magistrates immediately interpreted as her having a demonic servant. Based on this, 4-year-old Dorothy was arrested and chained in a dark, filthy dungeon for nearly 8 months. At first, she was with her mother and her newborn sister Mercy, but soon, Mercy died in the deplorable prison. Then Dorothy watched as her mother was taken away to be hanged. She was left all alone. She was finally released in December 1692, but the damage was done. The trauma of her imprisonment and the loss of her family left her psychologically shattered. Years later, her father wrote that she had been so hardly used and terrified in the dungeon that she was left chargeable, with little or no reason to govern herself. The story of Dorothy Good reveals a system so committed to its delusion that it was willing to chain up a 4-year-old girl and destroy her life. On the other side of this tragedy stands Ann Putnam Jr. At 12 years old, she was one of the original afflicted girls and arguably the most devastating of all the accusers. She was intelligent, and along with her friends, she was at the absolute center of the storm. Ann's name appears again and again in court records. She testified against dozens of people and claimed to have been tormented by 62 individuals. But Ann was not acting in a vacuum. She was a Putnam. Her father, Thomas Putnam, was a primary instigator of the trials who filed many of the official complaints. Her mother, Ann Putnam Sr., also claimed to be afflicted. The Putnams were at the heart of the village's deepest feud, the bitter rivalry with the Porter family. It's no coincidence that a staggering number of Ann Jr.'s accusations were aimed at people connected to the Porters or involved in property disputes with her family. For instance, she was a key accuser of Rebecca Nurse, a respected elderly woman whose family had a long-standing land dispute with the Putnams. In this light, Ann's afflictions look less like random fits and more like a weapon being wielded in her family's social and political war. What makes Ann's story so complex, however, is what happened years later. In 1706, 14 years after the trials, Ann Putnam Jr. did something none of the other accusers ever did. She stood before the Salem Village congregation as the new minister read a public apology she had written. In it, she expressed her desire to be humbled before God for her role in the tragedy. She stated that she now believed the people she accused were innocent. She didn't take full responsibility, however, instead blaming her actions on a great delusion of Satan that had deceived her as a child. It wasn't a full confession of lies, but it was a stunning admission of error. By this time, both of her parents were dead, and Ann was left to raise her younger siblings alone. She herself would die unmarried at the age of 37. Her apology remains one of the most fascinating documents from the period, a hint of remorse from the heart of the storm. Chapter 5: The Lingering Shadows. The madness of the Salem witch trials ended almost as abruptly as it began. By the autumn of 1692, the accusations had spun wildly out of control. Respected ministers were being accused, wealthy merchants were implicated, and the accusations even reached the wife of the governor, Sir William Phips. The elite who had once sanctioned the trials now found themselves in the crosshairs. This, more than any sudden return to reason, is what brought it all to a halt. In October 1692, Governor Phips ordered a stop to the court of Oyer and Terminer, the special court hearing the witchcraft cases. He replaced it with a new court that was forbidden from admitting spectral evidence as a basis for conviction. This was the critical blow. The visions of the accusers were the only proof in most cases. Without it, the prosecutions collapsed. In May 1693, Governor Phips issued a general pardon for all remaining prisoners, effectively ending the nightmare. But ending the trials and admitting fault are two very different things. In the immediate aftermath, there was a quiet but concerted effort by those in power to downplay their role. Instead of confessing to a catastrophic failure of justice, the official story became one of collective delusion, blaming the whole affair on the trickery of Satan. The judges and magistrates who had eagerly condemned innocent people largely shifted the blame. Apologies and reparations came, but they were painfully slow and incomplete. It wasn't until 1711, nearly 2 decades later, that the colony passed a bill to formally reverse the convictions of 22 of the accused and offered a paltry financial sum to the victims and their families. Even then, not everyone was included. It took until 1957 for Massachusetts to formally apologize. And the very last victim, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., was not officially exonerated until 2022. This centuries-long delay speaks volumes about the reluctance to fully reckon with the sins of the past. For centuries, the simple explanation of mass hysteria persisted. But the real story was hiding in plain sight. It wasn't inexplicable madness, but a perfect storm of very human failings. First was the bitter factionalism, seen clearly in the Putnam-Porter feud. Historical analysis shows a stunning correlation. Many accusers led by the Putnams came from the struggling agricultural part of Salem Village, while a striking number of the accused were connected to the more prosperous Salem town and the Porter family. The trials became a weapon in a war over land, status, and power. Added to this was the profound psychological trauma that permeated the region. The constant threat of attack during King William's War, coupled with recent smallpox epidemics, created an atmosphere of pervasive fear. The fits of some accusers weren't necessarily fake. They were likely expressions of severe trauma, channeled through the only lens their culture provided: the supernatural. What was called hysteria was, in many ways, the unaddressed trauma of a generation. Finally, there's the ergotism theory. Some have proposed that the girls' physical symptoms, convulsions, and hallucinations could be explained by accidentally eating ergot, a fungus that can grow on rye bread and contains a substance similar to LSD. While it's an interesting idea, this theory is not widely accepted by historians today. It simply cannot account for the cold, calculated nature of the accusations. It doesn't explain why the girls accused specific people tied to their family's grudges. Ergot may have played a role, but it wasn't the cause. The cause was human, fear, greed, and a lust for power. The story of Salem is a terrifying reminder of how quickly fear and greed can dismantle a society. But Salem isn't the only historical event with dark secrets hiding in plain sight. What other moments in history do you believe are misunderstood? Let us know in the comments what event you want us to uncover next. And if you want to keep digging into these forgotten stories, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Conclusion. In the end, the dark secret of the Salem witch trials isn't that witches were real. The secret is that they didn't need to be. The real monsters in this story weren't supernatural beings conspiring with the devil. They were ordinary people, jealous neighbors, ambitious land grabbers, and self-righteous magistrates who allowed their own biases to masquerade as divine justice. What happened in Salem was not simply mass hysteria. It was a perfect storm of social anxiety, religious extremism, political rivalry, and deep-seated personal hatreds that found its outlet in legalized murder. The victims, from 4-year-old Dorothy Good to the defiant Bridget Bishop, and the martyred Giles Corey, weren't random. They were targeted. They were inconvenient. They were in the way. The cover-up that followed, the centuries of blaming Satan, was a final act of injustice, an attempt to absolve a community of its own guilt. But the records remain. The stories of the victims endure. The ghosts of Salem aren't the spirits of witches on Gallows Hill. They are the echoes of injustice, the chilling whispers of what happens when a society becomes so convinced of its own righteousness that it sacrifices its humanity. They are a warning, as urgent today as it was over 300 years ago, of the darkness that lurks not in the supernatural world, but within the human heart.